Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your questions, your research, and really get to the heart of the matter.
Or that's the plan.
Today, we're diving into something pretty interesting. Comparing, well, contrasting the newer blockchain, Sui, with the more established Cardano.
Right. Especially for someone who knows Cardano but is new to Siri. We're looking at validators, dapps, the core stuff.
Exactly. We've got Sui's own docs, some market info, general stuff. The goal here is to give you a good handle on Sui, see how it lines up with Cardano, without getting lost in the weeds.
Yeah, think of it as a primer on Sui, using Cardano as a kind of reference point. Let's nail down what makes Sui tick.
Okay, so starting point. Sui calls itself a groundbreaking Layer 1 blockchain built for internet-scale use. Straight away, they're talking security, power, scalability. Makes you ask, what's the secret sauce compared to older chains?
Well, their foundation is quite different. They use an object-centric data model. That's a big shift from the usual account-based systems like Ethereum or even Cardano in some ways.
Object-centric.
Yeah, and it's built using the Move programming language. Move itself was designed with security and asset safety baked in from the start. These aren't small choices. They really shape how the whole thing works.
And this object model, treating everything as a unique asset, that sounds like it could open up some interesting possibilities.
It definitely does. We can get into that. But they're also pushing hard on the user experience side, which is often a sticking point in Web3, right?
Totally. I saw things like Zyke login, using regular web logins and sponsored transactions where someone else might cover the gas fee. That feels like a real attempt to lower the barrier to entry.
It absolutely is. They want developers to build apps that feel, well, normal, like the Web2 apps we use all the time. Smooth, intuitive. That's where the Sui development kit, the SDK, comes into play.
Right, the SDK. Tools for developers.
Yep, providing tools in common languages like TypeScript and Rust makes it way easier for developers to get started.
And it looks like a pretty full toolkit, actually. There's the Sui RPC. They mentioned GraphQL for new stuff, JSON RPC for older systems.
Good support there.
Resources for Move itself. The Move book, the Move reference, the command line interface, the Sui CLI, even IDE support in VS Code. They seem serious about developer support.
You need that, right? If you want people to build cool things, you've got to give them good tools. Using languages like TypeScript is smart, brings in folks from web development, and having an ecosystem directory and a blog shows there's activity, a community building up.
Okay, let's zero in on what our listeners specifically asked about. Validators. Now, on Sui, these sound like more than just standard nodes. They have extra duties. How do you become one?
Right, it's a step up. First, there's the tech side, setting up the validator node. They've got a guide on GitHub for that. But the big one, the headline item, is the staking requirement.
Ah, yes. How much?
You need a minimum of 30 million SUI tokens in your staking pool just to request joining the active set.
30 million SUI. Wow. Okay, let's put that in perspective. We saw a price around, what, nearly $4?
Yeah, around 397 cents in the source data.
So 30 million times almost 4.
Yeah.
That's like 120 million US dollars. That's a massive commitment.
It really is a huge financial stake.
Compared to, say, Cardano's requirements for running a stake pool. This seems significantly higher. Does that maybe lead to fewer, larger validators running the network?
That's a really good question. It's a design choice that definitely favors, well, very committed players. It could impact the degree of decentralization compared to networks with lower entry barriers. And it doesn't stop there. Once you're in, you need to keep your stake above 20 million SUI. If it dips below that, you get a grace period, 7 epochs, so about 7 days to bring it back up.
And if you don't?
If it falls under 15 million SUI, you're removed from the active set at the end of that epoch. So maintaining that substantial stake is non-negotiable. An epoch, by the way, is roughly 24 hours on Sui.
Makes sense for security, I guess. You want validators to have serious skin in the game. The hardware specs looked pretty intense, too. 24-core CPU, 128 gigs of RAM, big NVMe drive. Not your average desktop setup.
No, definitely not. It reflects the kind of processing power and storage needed to handle consensus and keep things running fast, especially if they hit those high transaction speeds they're aiming for.
So how does the consensus actually work? The voting power, I saw it's fixed at 10,000 total, and you need 6,667 for quorum.
Correct. 2/3, basically.
And a validator's power is based on their stake, but capped at 10% 1,000 power. What if they have enough stake for more than 10%?
Good catch. If their stake would naturally give them, say, 15% of the power, it gets capped at 10%. that extra 5% worth of voting power. It gets redistributed proportionally among all the other validators.
Ah, okay, so it prevents any single validator from getting too dominant in the voting process.
Exactly. It's a decentralization safeguard baked into the mechanism.
Now, what about regular users? People like you and me who don't have $120 million lying around but still want to support the network and earn rewards. Delegation right.
Yep, delegated proof of stake. You can delegate your SUI to a validator's pool. When you do that, your SUI gets wrapped into something called a staked SUI token.
Staked SUI.
Okay. And your rewards basically come from the changing exchange rate between SUI and staked SUI over time. When you decide to unstake, you request a withdrawal.
How fast does that happen?
The withdrawal itself is processed pretty much immediately, but it uses the exchange rate from the previous epoch.
So not the current ongoing epochs rate.
Correct. So you get your original stake back, plus all the rewards earned up until the end of the last completed epoch. Any rewards accumulating in the current epoch while your withdrawal is pending, you wouldn't get those.
Got it. A slight lag on the very latest rewards. And I noticed you can't withdraw just part of an active stake.
Not directly from a single staked SUI object, no. But the workaround is simple. If you think you might want to unstake partially later, you just create multiple staked SUI objects when you first delegate. Stake 100 SUI as 5 separate 20 SUI stakes, for example.
Smart. How do people track that exchange rate?
It's published at the end of every epoch in an event called Validator Epoch Info. Developers can pull this using SUI's event APIs.
And rewards. Everyone in the pool gets the same proportional rate increase, right? The validator takes a cut too.
Exactly. All delegators in a pool share the rewards proportionally through that exchange rate appreciation. The validator then earns a commission, a percentage calculated on the total rewards generated by their pool.
Where does the money for rewards actually come from? Transaction fees.
Primarily 2 places. Transaction gas fees paid by users, that's one. And initially, there's also a pool of stake subsidies. About 10% of the total SUI supply was set aside for this to kind of kickstart rewards and incentivize people early on.
So subsidies help now, but long-term, it's more reliant on network usage and gas fees.
That's the typical model, yes. Oh, and one timing detail. When you deposit stake, it sits as pending until the next epoch starts. Withdrawals, as we said, are immediate based on the last epoch's rate.
Okay. Pending deposits, immediate withdrawals. That's clear. So validators secure the network, process transactions. What else? There was something about gas prices. A reference gas price?
Yes, that's another key role. SUI aims for more stable, predictable gas fees, unlike the wild swings you sometimes see elsewhere. Validators are central to this.
How does that work?
Each epoch, every validator proposes a gas price they think is right for the next epoch. Then, the network looks at all these proposals, weighs them by each validator's stake, and calculates the 23rd percentile price. So the price level that at least 2/3 of the total stake agrees on, or is lower than, that calculated price becomes the official reference gas price for the entire next epoch.
Interesting. So it's like a consensus on the base fee level for the next 24 hours.
Pretty much. It's called the gas price survey. The idea is to smooth out short-term spikes and give users a more predictable cost baseline.
That sounds actually useful. Predictability is good. Now, what about keeping validators honest? I saw a validator slashing and tallying rule. Sounds serious.
It is. It's about accountability. SUI encourages the community to monitor validators, but there's also this tallying rule where validators basically score each other.
Peer review.
Sort of, yeah. If a validator consistently gets low scores from its peers, maybe it's offline often or not participating correctly, some of its stake rewards can get slashed, penalized.
How does the scoring work?
The overall score is calculated at the end of each epoch. Validators are expected to actively monitor others. The default score is 1. If you see bad behavior, you might update your score for that validator to 0. It's a system for self-regulation within the validator set with real financial teeth.
And presumably people could build tools, dashboards to track this performance publicly.
Exactly. That's the hope. Transparency and community monitoring backed by this tallying rule mechanism.
Okay, that's a fascinating approach to network health. Let's shift gears a bit. What can you actually do on SUI? What about the dapps, the applications?
Right. The whole point is to enable developers to build great Web3 apps, ideally with better user experiences, using that SDK we mentioned. And we are seeing stuff emerge. DeFi is definitely active.
Like what, DX is?
Lending. Yeah, things like Turbos Finance, Bluefin, Aftermath, Kria, NEVI, Cetus Protocol. Covers decentralized exchanges, lending, borrowing, the usual DeFi suspects.
Makes sense. DeFi is often the first wave. What else is popping up?
NFTs are big too. You've got marketplaces like Hyperspace and Tradeport for trading SUI NFTs. Gaming is another major focus area for SUI. They talk a lot about how their architecture suits things like tradable in-game items.
True digital ownership in games. Yeah.
And then there's infrastructure stuff like SUINS, the SUI name service. Kind of like ENS on Ethereum. You register a user-friendly name like myname.sui.
That name is an NFT itself.
Exactly. It's an NFT you own. You can link it to your wallet address, maybe set an avatar, even potentially point it to a decentralized website hosted on IPFS or something. Personalization for your Web3 identity.
So quite a bit developing already. DeFi, NFTs, gaming potential, identity.
Yeah.
Now, underpinning all this is the SUI token itself. Total supply, 10 billion.
Correct. 10 billion total and maximum supply.
And its main uses, we touched on staking.
Yep. Proof of stake participation is number one, either directly as a validator or delegating. Number two is paying gas fees for transactions and storage.
Standard utility there.
Number three is general utility within dapps, maybe used in DeFi protocols, game economies, things like that. And number four, looking forward, is governance. Holding SUI is expected to give you a say in the network's future direction.
Okay. The documentation also mentioned a SUI storage fund. What's that about? Sounds different.
It is pretty innovative. It's basically a mechanism designed for long-term network health. Think about storing all that blockchain data forever. It costs something, right?
Search storage isn't free.
So the storage fund collects some fees up front when data is stored. And the idea is that the returns generated by this fund can be used to pay future validators for the ongoing cost of keeping that data available. It tries to solve the long-term economics of permanent storage.
Interesting. A way to make sure old data doesn't become an unfunded burden.
Exactly. And just to quickly recap the tech securing it all. Delegated proof of stake, like we said, using consensus protocols called Narwhal and Bullshark, they're designed for high throughput.
Right, those potential speeds.
Yeah.
Over 297,000 transactions per second in test. That's huge.
It's a massive number. If achievable in practice, it could really enable applications that just aren't feasible on slower chains. Think high-frequency DeFi, complex games with lots of on-chain actions. That's the promise of SUI's architecture, with its parallel processing and object model.
And if people want to get SUI tokens,
Available on major centralized exchanges, the data we had showed a price near $3.97, market cap over $13 billion. Obviously, that fluctuates.
of course. Okay, so we've built a pretty good picture of SUI. Now, circling back to the listener's comparison point, Cardano. How do they stack up at a high level based on what we know about SUI?
Well, the obvious similarity is they both use validators. Cardano calls them stake pool operators, SPOs, for network security via proof of stake. And both are platforms for building dapps. So the basic functions are there in both cases.
Right, validators, these apps, check, check. Where do the philosophies seem to differ then?
Based on SUI's design that we've discussed, its focus seems really heavily geared towards scalability from the outset through horizontal scaling, and achieving that partly via this unique object-centric model and the move language.
And the parallel transaction processing.
And the parallel processing, exactly. Even bypassing consensus for simple transfers sometimes. These seem like specific architectural choices aimed at achieving high throughput and low latency in a particular way. Cardano has also evolved significantly over time, focusing on security, methodical research, and its own scalability solutions like Hydra, but its underlying architecture, the UTXO model extended with PUDA scripts, is just fundamentally different from SUI's object-based move approach.
So different paths to similar goals. Both want secure, scalable platforms for dApps, but the how is quite distinct. SUI's object focus versus Cardano's extended UTXO. Move versus Plutus Haskell. Different engineering trade-offs.
Precisely. It's not necessarily about one being better overall, but about different designs potentially suited for different things, or reflecting different priorities at their inception. For someone coming from Cardano, understanding SUI's object model is probably the key conceptual leap.
That makes a lot of sense. It shows there's more than one way to build these complex systems.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really great deep dive into SUI's foundations, especially seeing it alongside a project like Cardano. We've covered the core ideas, the validator mechanics, the dApp scene, the token. Quite a journey.
Yeah, hopefully this gives you, especially our listener familiar with Cardano, a solid grounding in what SUI is doing and how it's maybe trying to tackle things differently. Validators, dApps, yes, both have them, but the engine underneath is quite unique in SUI's case.
Definitely. And if you want to dig even deeper, the official SUI documentation is the place to go. Plus, checking out market data on sites like CoinMarketCap.
For sure. You know, thinking about this, It leaves you with a question, doesn't it? Given SUI's specific architecture, the object model, move, the focus on UX and scalability, what kind of new applications might this unlock? Things that were maybe just too hard or clunky to build before on older platforms.
Hmm. What does that object-centric view really enable for digital assets, for how we interact online in the future?
Exactly. That's something interesting to keep an eye on as the ecosystem matures.